Hi, my name's Lara Spirit. I am a reporter here at Tortoise, and thank you so much to everybody who's joined us here in the newsroom tonight, and also everybody who is joining us from home. Tonight's ThinkIn topic is, are Labour's foundations its biggest obstacles? I love this question. I think it's a pretty provocative question. I also think it could serve as a proxy for a number of other questions around how we think about ideas, how we think about history, how we think about personalities and policies and platforms and politics. So I think it's a fantastic question. We're also blessed because we're joined by three fantastic guests. One in the newsroom tonight, Denis MacShane, former minister under Tony Blair, and at home, Ayesha Hazarika, who is a broadcaster, commentator, and was a senior political advisor for the Labour Party, Harriet, Harman and Ed Miliband, who she advised, and also Nathan Yeowell, who is Executive Director of Progressive Britain and author of Rethinking Labour's Past.
And Ayesha is a comedian. That's what Labour's always missed. It needs more comedians and less serious
Well, I will
people.
let her respond to that at some point, but I do want to come to you first because you've written this book, which is a good shameless plug for the book. And I think you're probably the best person to go to talk a bit about what Labour's foundations actually are, or at least what they're understood to be, before we get on to, I mean, the scale of the challenge, right, is huge, because to win a majority in the next election, Labour needs to win 120 seats. So a 12% lead or so in the popular polls, a bigger swing than we saw in 1997. So a huge hill to climb. And I'm sure that we'll get on to whether or not people think that's a realistic hill to climb tonight. But first off, with this particular question, because I'm wary of this discussion just going into the classic question of, will Labour always lose, for example? Because I do think that it's a really meaningful inquiry thinking about the way that the Labour Party came to be, what the Labour foundations are, and what our relationship for people who support the Labour Party should be with the kind of history of ideas and the former successes and or failures of the party before. So if you could talk a bit about what you actually think these foundations are when we talk about the foundations of the Labour Party.
Very simply, we know what they are in this country. All the craft unions, that's to say, going back to the Middle Ages, the steel workers, the tool makers, the carpenters, the electricians, as they needed more defence of the right to strike, to organise, formed a party. Before that, they turned to the Liberal Party, which helped a little bit. And actually, we must never forget conservative paternalism, noblesse oblige, to use that term. It's always been very, very strong. And so the party was formed, and really it was quickly distorted by two huge events, two world wars, because for the first time in history, the working class in the world's democracies and in the anti-democracies had the right to be taken seriously, because they were the cannon fodder for Kaisers and kings and generals. And that's what bought them the entry ticket, even more so, I'd say, in the Second World War, when the Second World War was basically a war of which was the strongest capitalism, which economic system could produce fastest, good tanks, good aeroplanes, good naval ships, good ammunition. And the answer was the United States could, because it wasn't threatened by war, a bit done here in Britain. And for that, you needed workers. I mean, American trade union organisation took off, not because of Roosevelt. Unemployment in America in 1941 was at 13%. By 1942, it had fallen to 0.5%. And when workers have got the right, I mean, not the right, when workers are working, they're at work, they're employed, bingo, they have extraordinary social power. And that is what we've really not been a bit reluctant. We see the growth of the Labour Party as a sort of moral crusade. But I remember an interesting discussion between Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's chief of staff, and a very serious sort of modernising left thinker, in addition to being an extraordinarily good civil servant, and Ralph Dahrendorf, who I expect nobody here, other than Matthew maybe, knows who he is, who was a German sociologist, a liberal, Free Democrat it's called, who just transferred to Britain and made a great career in St Anthony's College running it, then LSE running it and writing. And he was a very wonderful, warm man. And Jonathan and Ralph were together as one is, in a Swiss mountain restaurant. And Jonathan was, this is about, I'm just looking at my diaries, this is sort of late 1990s, just after Blair wins. And he is saying the failure was the split between the trade unions and the liberals at the beginning of the century. Daniel said that's nonsense. Everywhere in Europe, social democratic parties came into being because the liberals weren't delivering. They were delivering for other liberals, other bourgeoisie, other rich people, like today. And so poorer people need a voice. They don't have one now. They have false voices in France, like Marine Le Pen, or Nigel Farage here, or Jean-Luc Mélenchon, or, sad to say, Jeremy Corbyn. But the real trick is to combine both what workers need, what middle classes need, and Labour's not been very, very good at that, I would say. So the foundation...
You would say the foundations, unions, in a sense...
Yeah, I mean, that's a traditional one.
The working class,
and that's
socialism...
Obviously the working class under all circumstances in any country. But the question is, does the working class form a social democratic party, which it did in northern European countries, in Germany, in Austria? They came back to life, particularly after 1945. Or does it form a Labourist party which defends simply trade union interests? And partly, I would argue, the reason why, in my book, I point out, since 1966, in my adult life, Labour has won elections in just 4 of the years since then. It's not a great record. I stood for Parliament in all of them, 74, 97,
And do you think that's because of its foundations?
Because, yes, indeed. It is unthinkable in Germany or Sweden or the Netherlands or Norway for any general secretary of a trade union to get up at the Labour Party or the Social Democratic Party conference and say, this is what you must do. It is unthinkable that trade unions sit on the ruling bodies, committees of social democratic parties in Europe and decide through the donations they give, the votes they have, what the policy should be, or choosing, for example, who might be candidates. That is a very specific British left Labour deviation. And I think if you look at the number of years Labour has spent in opposition, you should start thinking again about whether putting so much, not power, they're good people, they're friends of mine, I've worked for trade unions all my adult life, but they should do their job and left political parties should do their jobs. A lot of overlap, but not a formal fusion.
And on this, I should also say that we'd love everybody to share their views if they have
please.
them. Just raise your hand and we'll come to you. And if you're at home, raise your digital hand.
Len McCluskey, are you listening in? Yes, okay.
For any of your thoughts in the chat, Ella Hill, my colleague, is marshalling the chat, and I'm sure we'll point out anybody who wants to join in. But on this question, reading your book, it made me think how much the Labour Party has obviously changed over the decades, but also how much the country has changed over the decades, and particularly how much class has changed. So I think, and the reason why this question is quite interesting is because it's also, in a sense, a proxy for are Labour's foundations relevant to the most important challenges that people in Britain face today, for example, and the changing nature, the change in the working class, for example. So this idea that if you're middle class, you're more likely to be a member of a trade union than if you're working class. And if you're middle class, you're more likely to work for an organisation with more than 100 members. You're more likely to identify as left of centre, for example. Do you think that realignment, along with demography, is one of the reasons why people find this question quite an important one?
I think so. In France, where the socialist candidate of the official Parti Socialiste, she got 1.8% of the vote on Sunday. In France, I'd say almost not a single employee in the private sector is in a trade union. Fewer and fewer are here, about 11% of TUC members are in the private, if you like, capitalist sector, to use that phrase, but confronting bosses who are creating added value, wealth, and having a serious struggle with them over the internal distribution of that wealth. Does it stay with workers before it goes out to shareholders and, I suppose, in the form of big pay or bonuses for bosses. No, the majority of workers now, employees in Britain, 86% of TUC membership, about 98% of French trade union membership, are in the public sector. They're teachers, they're nurses, they're doctors, they're council employees, all deserve a good trade union, a good representation, but they're not confronting capitalism. The only way their needs, which are perfectly legitimate, can be satisfied is if everybody else pays more taxes or accepts cuts in public services. Now that's a very different debate from where you simply point your finger at the big boss with the top hat and the cigar and says, you can afford to give us more money. We don't like to really discuss that.
Tax.
Tax is part of the problem. I mean, the paradox is that the great Clement Attlee government, we all admire and worship it, it did great things like bringing in the NHS, bringing in family allowances, mothers' allowances. I mean, I'm a product of it, and all sorts of terrific things, free education, council housing. But in 1950, a worker on the average industrial male wage didn't pay any tax. So socialism's wonderful, somebody else pays for it. And by about the time I got, in an adult sense, involved in politics, 1970s, workers were paying 30-40% of their income in tax. So you just have to keep thinking and rethinking and rethinking. And what we haven't had in my lifetime, we've gone up so many blind alleys. We've gone up the anti-European blind alley. We've gone up the anti-consumerism blind alley. There's a great story about a Lara Bevin, who was this magical Welsh Labour politician who was one of the founding fathers as the health secretary of the NHS, of course. And he's discussing at the Labour Party conference why, in 1959, why Labour lost the election. And he said, the Tories went round and they promised people television sets and washing machines and a refrigerator and a motoring car on something called the Never Never. Labour will never do that. And oh, thanks. No, yeah, okay. Living in a nice cottage given to him by Lord Beaverbrook on one of his country estates. And if you don't look at the material existence of the people you want to get to vote for you, it's been all over Europe a huge problem with handling quite strong flows of immigration. I think they can be handled, but they're tricky. And you've got to be constantly paying attention to it. But also, the argument of my book is, the discussion I want Labour to have is power. We have got so many brilliant Labour intellectuals, great writers about politics, at least one or two I can see here in this room, who could discuss the policies that are necessary, the personalities that are necessary, whether there should be one member, one vote, the relative power of the Labour NEC and the leader's office and the Parliamentary Labour Party. I mean, all of it good, fine stuff. There are great books written, biographies of Labour leaders. I haven't read a single book in my lifetime by anybody writing from a left or Labour position, a professor, an academic, a sociologist, an essayist, doesn't matter whether it's New Statesman, Novara, or the Times Literary Supplement, that actually says, this is what power is. This is how you get it. This is what you need to do to think about it and make Labour think about power. It's the one taboo subject. It's like discussing, women priests in the Vatican. Just don't do it. And Labour's terrified of discussing
Well, I
power.
guess this question is one of them. And someone that's thought a lot about this, I'm sure, will be Ayesha, who obviously was advising the Labour government. I don't know if you're there, Ayesha, but I'm really keen to ask. Hello.
Hello.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm really keen to ask, particularly about that beginning period and then into the kind of middle and end of your period advising senior Labour politicians, when we were about to see the sort of final years of Labour government that we've seen in a very, very long time, whether this question of their foundations was sort of preying on their mind, and whether you think it's quite reductive to think in terms of Labour Party politics as this constant struggle between the sort of old foundational principles and organisations who brought it to life and mobilised many of its former and current members, or ideas, and this idea of kind of forward-thinking electoral kind of prospects as being a more kind of rational approach.
I'd probably go back a bit with my own sort of journey, because I was a civil servant to begin with. I was a civil servant from 1997 and was very apolitical at that point. I started my life delivering post in the Ministry of Agriculture and press office. So that was sort of my beginning. So I kind of had this really interesting journey through a Labour government. And what was fascinating at the beginning was seeing Labour come in as this very modernising force. Even in the civil service, you know, I was a civil servant, I was working in the press office. People were like astonished at the modernity that the Labour Party brought. It felt very, very new. And I think that was part of the appeal of when the Labour Party won. I mean, when I think about type of people that Tony Blair attracted to the party. So take my parents, for example, they had always traditionally voted Conservative. A lot of Asian people had been kind of small c Conservative on social issues, on economic issues. But Tony Blair and Labour at that time, you know, put forward a sort of different type of Labour Party. Probably my parents' generation just thought of the traditional Labour vote as not really including people like them. They saw it being kind of very much for a traditional working class background, but that being white, that being quite aggressive as well in terms of like the sort of faces of the trade union movement. So I think that what Labour did in the run up to 1997 was very artful, because it was proud of its heritage, but it wasn't kind of hidebound by it as well. You know, it said, look, we want different people to join this movement. And I think sometimes when we think about the roots of the Labour Party, you should always think about your roots. I think that's an incredibly important thing, whether you're an individual person, whether you're an organisation, whether you're a political party. But you shouldn't be trapped in your roots either. You shouldn't sort of create a sort of prison from which you can never escape. And you shouldn't get to the point where you're so sort of nostalgic about your past that you can't see what's happening right in front of you, and you can't see what's happening with you and with the future. So I think we find ourselves in this kind of really, really strange situation where Labour politicians, certainly the ones that I have worked with over the years, have often felt like every so often you've got to sort of virtue signal to your sort of heritage, even in a way which doesn't actually feel that authentic anymore, because the Labour Party had moved on in many ways, and also society's moved on. But every so often people had to sort of do a kind of virtue signalling to the past and to the sort of Labour heritage and the Labour tradition. But at the same time, the Labour Party also felt it was kind of becoming disconnected from the people it sought to serve in the here and now. And I think what Labour really, really has to do is, yes, respect the heritage of the Labour Party. That is incredibly important. And in many ways, the sort of rights of working people it's never been more important for a Labour Party to stand up for them. You just look at what's happened with P&O ferries. We're looking at this time when workers are under more and more pressure with insecure work. We all know the script in this discussion, but we haven't found a way to sort of communicate that to a huge number of working people, because we just only talk about trade unions. And as Denis alluded to, that is, you know, fewer and fewer people are members of trade unions. There is a whole generation of people who know nothing about trade unions. Certainly when I worked in the private sector, there was, you know, they didn't have a trade union where we worked. So there's got to be a sort of fresh look, drawing on the best of Labour Party heritage and value and history, but making it modern. I just feel that we are very, very, very trapped. Like when I worked with government ministers and with different politicians, they would always be trying to look to the future and kind of failing to do that. And then they'd suddenly panic about the Durham, you know, gala, the miners' gala, and sort of want to go, but also be frightened to go because, you know, they wouldn't do I have enough knowledge about the sort of heritage? And it's just like this kind of, so I think and if you look at the Conservative Party, one of the reasons why they are so ruthless at the acquisition and retention of power is that they always shapeshift in terms of where modern society is. I mean, they completely change their sort of clothing all the time in terms of who they're trying to appeal to. Now, they can appeal to people very successfully. Whether they execute their delivery for those people, of course, is a completely different picture. But we don't do that in the Labour Party because we're still, you know, sometimes when I get trolled on Twitter, people go back through the like eons of history in terms of like bringing up like a point from like an NEC meeting in sort of 1944, like that's a boom, like a slam, and you're like, I don't even know how to like deal, like I really don't, like meanwhile, like the Tories are like sweeping through the red wall and all this kind of stuff, and you're just like, oh my God, you know. So,
and are there structural reasons in the Labour Party, when you think about the way that decisions are made and the way that leaders are chosen, do you think there are structural ways in which the foundations of the Labour Party are getting in the way to their potential to win the next general election?
Well, I think that's definitely been the case in terms of how, you know, leaders were selected. And I do remember back in 2010, after we lost the general election, and Harriet Harman was acting leader, and I was working for her. I do remember seeing the might of the trade unions at that point, just from a structural point of view, in terms of if a candidate, you know, was backed by a trade union, just the advantage that they would have in terms of getting leaflets out to people and how much that all cost, and having that infrastructure in place. And I do remember at one point we suggested, I think it was like to the NEC, you know, maybe we to kind of even the playing field, we should get all the big unions to send out, you know, details of all the candidates, and that went down like a poo sandwich. I'm absolutely honest. And they were like, why would we do that? Because we've got our people that we're sort of backing. So absolutely, there are very, very powerful forces within the party, which definitely, you know, can influence through infrastructure and money and all of that sort of stuff. But I think just on our relationship with the trade unions, I do think that it shouldn't be a sort of all or nothing. You know, we've got to have a more nuance. It's not that the trade unions are all good or the trade unions are all bad. The trade unions are an incredibly important part of our tradition, and we should be very, very close to trade unions. But we've got to have a sort of grown-up relationship with trade unions. We should respect the heritage of the trade unions. We should be working closely with them. But the trade unions shouldn't also, you know, hold a gun to the head of the Labour Party. And, you know, I remember watching the McCluskey do a lunch at the House of Commons to the press gallery. And he basically said, if the Labour leader doesn't do what I want, I will set up a separate party and, move it. And that is completely unhelpful. You are not meant to donate money to the party to get you a veto over policy. One would hope that there's a good symbiotic relationship. And also, we should be helping as a political movement. We should be helping the trade union movement modernise and evolve and change and grow as well, particularly with the gig economy, particularly moving into the private sectors, particularly with more and more people being sort of self-employed. So I feel quite sad that this relationship between the trade unions and the leadership of the Labour Party, it almost feels like, you know, and the media set this up as well, which is for any future leader of the Labour Party, until they've had an absolute raging row with the trade union leader, then somehow they're not fit to be leader of the Labour Party or lead the country. And I don't think that is how the relationship should be, particularly in a post sort of P&O ferry world. You know, you should have a good, smart, strong, empathetic leader of the Labour Party, and equally good, strong, empathetic, clever, smart, modern leaders of the trade union movement. You should make both those things attractive to sort of everyday people.
I'm keen to come to Jim Knight on this as well, because he's made a really good point in the chat about political messaging, which I think chimes with what you've said. But first, if I can come to Nathan, if you're there, because I'm sure you've done a huge amount of thinking about this at progressive Britain. And I wonder what you think, particularly to this point about the structural power that unions have and the way in which we can modernise our Labour's relationship with unions and kind of the way in which we communicate Labour's relationships with unions to the electorate. I know that you've done a bunch of work on this, including your book, Rethinking Labour's Past. Could you just talk a bit to that, to kind of frame that debate?
Of course, and thanks for having me. I think on that first question about the role of the trade unions in the way that the party runs and policy and procedures are run, let's not forget there was actually a serious reform package that was voted through last year's party conference, and part of the reason for that, reversing some of the reforms that Jeremy Corbyn had brought in after 2015, and part of the reason for that was because essentially, I'd say for the last decade or so, but definitely in the past 5 or 6 years, the party has spent far too much time talking to itself and indeed talking to some of the trade union paymasters. I think both Ayesha and Denis have mentioned to me now. Len McCluskey, quite frankly, ended up with far too much power and influence in the councils of the Labour Party after 2015. And I think it shows, and indeed, I think that is one of the major reasons why Labour ended up doing so badly, because it shows there was a massive divergence between actually what the trade union should be concentrating on, i.e. working with Labour to succeed at a general election, to put into place policies and practices that benefit the greater good of the country. And instead, we had a period of years when McCluskey and other senior trade union figures decided they wanted to play in sectarian left-wing politics, and essentially many people in the UK are much worse off for that, because it left us in such a state in 2019. So I think some of the reforms last year have started off in the right direction about rebalancing that relationship within the Labour Party and allowing MPs and others in the party to concentrate much more on speaking to the public. I mean, Ayesha mentioned this issue about the favoured status that trade union candidates have in selection contests within the Labour Party. I mean, they still do. There's still a formal section of the party. I think one of the reforms that was brought in last year reduced the cap on how much candidates can spend, and also reduced the schedule and the timetable for selections, because quite frankly, they were endurance tests, and essentially you needed a hell of a lot of money in your bank account to be able to actually pay for these contests, in some cases lasting 12, 14, 15 weeks, depending when the firing gun was officially or unofficially fired. I think in terms of actually looking forward on that relationship between Labour and the trade unions, you're right to keep on talking about P&O. I think P&O has been should be a watershed moment in actually realising what the positive public sort of benefit of strong trade unions should be in the country, and crucially in sort of our economy now that we're emerging out of both the post-COVID and the post-Brexit period, because in many respects we're writing the rules anew in the country now in the 2020s, and it's a fantastic opportunity for us to be sort of spearheading a positive message for trade unionism. And I think we've been doing some work on this at Progressive Britain, like you said. I think Andrew Pakes, who is the number 2, is the Assistant General Secretary at Prospect, the white collar trade union, which is not affiliated to the Labour Party, alongside young Bristol academic Harry Pitts. And we're sort of convening a piece of work over the next couple of months, which Denis will quite like. We're going to Germany and Scandinavia, so I'm hopping across the channel, which always gets me a big tick from Denis. But basically having a conversation to work out, but what does modern trade unionism... Sorry, Denis?
Sehr gut.
I'm not going to attempt to do an accent, but that's fine. And your Welsh accent, by the way, was pitiful. As a Welshman sitting there at the moment with no discernible trace of accent.
Sorry.
But we're actually looking at this, and I think it's actually, what is the role of trade unionism in the modern economy and in the modern society? I mean, Ayesha again pointed out issues with the gig economy, issues with those of us who have spent the last 2 years working from home, those of us who can't work from home, is how do we rebalance the economy and actually provide a level playing field for everybody in work? I think what's crucial for me, it's definitely something that Keir Starmer campaigned on. It's something that Claire Ainsley, the Director of Policy, wrote about extensively before she took the job on. There is now an opportunity for Labour to recast the politics of work. And I think in so doing, potentially we can put aside some of the myths and the potential problems and the baggage of the last 120 years, because essentially the vast majority of people in this country are workers. They're working men and women. And by concentrating on the needs of working families, that doesn't mean we exclude those people who are alienated from the labour market or indeed are unable to work, because of course we will always be there and arguing that we are there to provide them with more than a safety net to actually ensure that they have a platform from which they can live their lives as well as everybody else. But I think if we can recast the nature and the politics of work and look at it through the prism of time, of place, of whether we can go to work, or of the gig economy and other issues, that there's a fantastic opportunity for Labour to renew itself as a party that can speak again to, if not a majority, then to a significant minority of people in this country, as it did in '97. Because despite Mr. Blair's comments last week at King's College, that's what we did. It was a case, it was reuniting that coalition between what Ramsay MacDonald 100 years ago called a coalition between the working and the useful classes. We did it in the 90s, we did it in the 60s, we did it in the 40s, and we did it in the 20s. I mean, you mentioned the book. I think one of the things I found most interesting in doing the research for the book is, as we are now 120 years old, you can take a step back and take a long view of actually what the continuities and the changes might be in that period. And actually, the Labour Party has always had to struggle to renew itself within and without government, in large part because of the social and economic change it pursues when in government. I think in the 1960s and the 1980s, we brought through sort of landmark legislation, which essentially has had a transformative and long-lasting effect on British society, which the Conservatives have then been able to capitalise on. And at times, I agree, we've ended up arguing about what happened 5 or 10 or 20 years ago, and we've allowed the Conservatives to capitalise on some of that economic and social change. But when we realise that we've been essentially staring at our navel for too long, sometimes the fingers get clicked, and we can end up having a fantastic. We then end up in a position where the party comes together to fundamentally review and renew who it is and what it stands for, and then take the fight. To the
It's a very seems like a very interesting and delicate line between talking and not talking too much, right? And before I go to Tessa and Jim in the chat, I'm just quite keen to know if there's anyone who's able to make a sort of, who doesn't think that the Corbyn years were us in the wilderness, for example. So Joe, my friend, you're here, and were maybe still are a Corbyn supporter. But I think that it's important because so far we have largely heard from people who I think it's fair to say would probably agree that especially those Corbyn years, but also many of the intervening decades, those that Nathan were just talking about, were years of too much navel gazing, too much sort of like insular argument and bickering about ideas that were never going to win elections. And I remember you being particularly energised around the Corbyn project, and I wonder if you could speak a bit about this question, especially in relation to that.
Yeah, I think for me in particular, the Corbyn years were quite exciting because before that I hadn't really been engaged in politics at all. So for a politician to come along with quite a hopeful message, that really at the time inspired me. I think with this question in particular, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is almost sort of the opposite of the question, which is the current leader of the Labour Party. To my mind, you can sort of start to ask the question, is he actually a bit of an obstacle? And I think that what I mean by that is, for example, Keir Starmer has made quite a big point of, perhaps rightfully so, the lies and dishonesty of Boris Johnson, and we all have our opinions on that. But I think for me, I sort of question the credibility of Keir Starmer to make those sorts of comments when he himself has, I think, failed to keep a single one of the 10 pledges that he made in the Labour leadership election. And so, I mean, when looking at that, how can you sort of expect to trust him?
But do you have more faith in the kind of founding principles of the Labour movement than when you think about people like Keir Starmer, for example? Because there's this idea that they're sort of credible, right? Because they have this like heritage and history. Do you want to think while we go to Tessa?
Yeah.
Have a mull.
You've only got about 30 seconds, so go.
You've
Get a
definitely
crack
got
on.
more than 30 seconds.
In a good way. So rude. I take the point about hope, because I don't think you ever, 97 was a moment of hope, and it presented an alternative that was properly engaging with a leader who was properly engaging. I wonder if we can go on to the structural issues of the sort of division between the party and the PLP. We can also look at why Labour failed to harness the sort of youth enthusiasm with Corbyn, but didn't convert it into a vote properly. I think that's just really interesting in itself. And then I think we've still got this incredible lag from a perception point of view that Labour is still perceived as high tax, big government, party. And of course, all of those boundaries are completely blurred, particularly in the last couple of years. But I think there's a huge perception lag with people that that's what they're buying into with Labour. So in the absence of a positive offering, and by the way, I totally agree with the whole point about, if anything, if I were, in Ayesha's old shoes or something, the idea that you can't be a positive offering to represent people, to replace people who patently don't give a flying, about people, then that is quite a serious open goal in terms of how you engage with people to say, we are here for you in a way that no matter what they say, their actions kind of belie that every single day. But it has to be a positive offering. And also the perception is so wrong. I mean, if you look at the redistribution of wealth through the fiscal system in the first term of Tony Blair, it was a thing of beauty. I mean, it really was. You go back and look at how successful that was. But those messages just don't cut through. The internal fighting, the schism between PLP and
Why
party.
do you think they don't cut through?
Because I think we haven't had a leader like Blair.
So it's a leader.
I think it's absolutely
the
a
leader is
leadership
very
issue.
important.
Would you agree? I mean, it's interesting because a lot of people in the chat are making these points around powerful messaging. Jim, I don't know if you're there and want to speak a bit to what you said about we don't have a powerful enough message or platform that's credible in creating a more equitable country.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I get, I'm struck by this sense of, do we get elected on the basis of hope? And I think it's important that we are elected on as a change party, but you're always kind of paralysed. Back in '97, I think Tony was paralysed by, how radical can you afford to be and still win an election, or do you kind of wait for the other side to lose? And at the moment, the danger is that we aren't offering a credible enough change message because we don't want to take the risk, because frankly, the other side are looking so terrible. Maybe we can win anyway.
But
and I was really struck listening to James Harding's weekly voicemail this week, where he was talking about the Chancellor and Sunak. This is the time with cheap borrowing to borrow a load more money, particularly to invest in the training needs and the skills needs of the population, so that we can have a chance of creating a more productive economy, so that we can level up, so that we can do a whole bunch of things. That's an example of a more radical change message that I would like to see from my party.
Where do you think the fear comes from?
Well, it comes from perhaps quite an obsessive need to listen to focus groups and to poll and to, on a day-to-day basis be tracking sentiment, as opposed to saying, well, what's the right thing for us to do in government, and then how can we persuade the population to vote for it? I'm a New Labour. I was a New Labour MP. I'm a Labour peer. I kind of get the political realities of it all, but I do think we need to be braver.
Can I ask Jim, as a very good friend, play Blair in 1997, Jim. What was it you think he should have done and didn't do?
I think he, in office, he won a brilliant election, and that I can't criticise anything about that. But I think in office, particularly in that first term, he had a lot of political capital, and he was still too scared of the Daily Mail, and that there were things he could and should have done, particularly for the former industrial towns that subsequently, 20 years later, voted for Brexit, that could have made a real difference, and we could have just invested in those people a lot more with that political capital, rather than worrying so much about the polling in the Daily Mail.
Why are you shaking your head?
Well, only because, I represented Rotherham, which one of the seats there, not mine, went red wall, mainly because the Labour MP there backed Theresa May, backed Boris Johnson, and he announced his retirement in 2019. Labour chose a very nice woman from Sheffield councillor, 24, very, very strong feminist, whose main campaign was to support and defend the opening of lap dancing and pole clubs in a constituency mainly of retired coal miners and steel workers. And for some extraordinary reason, this wasn't a commanding way of winning the seat. But the basic reason was the Labour MP went Tory, as others did in Doncaster or Worksop. I can give you other examples. And so voters said, for God's sake, you've got a Tory MP that's backing Brexit, backing May, backing Johnson, with a tongue hanging out for a peerage. We might as well vote for the real thing and get a Tory MP, see if they're any good. They're useless, by the way, and they'll go at the next election. But seriously, Jim, I kind of agree with you. I was a great believer in regional government, really devolving power. So we put that to the people of the North East, regional government of the North East, and they said, you must be bloody joking.
Now, Denis, I'm sure you will agree with me that we could have done a much better job in selling membership of the European Union, in selling this sense of international solidarity.
Sure.
And we were scared. We were just scared of what the Daily Mail would say.
Well, Blair was scared to appoint me early enough. I could give a fuck about Daily Mail, but you're quite right. I mean, Robin Cook's special advisors were called in to see Alistair Campbell, and Laura, you were saying you were heavily involved in the People's Vote campaign.
I told you that in confidence.
Oh my God! The shame that dare not reveal its name. I was a pro-European, says Tortoise senior reporter. Alistair called in Robin's speechwriters and spads and said, get all that. Robin was Foreign Secretary in 1997, in a very creative way. We did a lot of great things. International Criminal Court. We stopped the Serb genocide in Kosovo. We stopped the killings in Sierra Leone. We defended democracy in Indonesia. I mean, he was actually a very big Foreign Secretary with, by the way, Blair's full endorsement. But they called Robin's speechwriters and spads in and said, Alistair did, and said, get all that pro-European shit out of Robin's speeches. Now that Blair walked in terror on making a strong case for Europe. I was on a plane, I didn't fly around with him all the time. We came back from somewhere, Warsaw, Madrid, doesn't matter. And he'd done a brilliant speech in favour of Europe. Europe's important, we've got to be European. And I said, Tony, I just heard you do another great speech about the importance of Europe, about the importance of the European Union, about the importance of European partnership, cooperation, and all the rest of it, and Britain and everything. Is there any chance you could make that speech in England? And he said, oh, what can I do with the fucking tabloids I've got? And that actually is also part, I think, Jim, of the problem. Can't blame the press. You know, Powell said a politician who blames the press is like a sea captain blaming the weather. But God, it's quite hard when all of our press is, nearly all of it is owned by offshore people who've got an agenda, and their agenda was very, very hostile to being in Europe.
So that is a separate set.
But we said we would also know we created ourselves. 1950. Sorry, this is all history, but we're talking about the foundation.
I'm very aware that having said we're not going to name
foundations and all that. 1950, the foundations of the European Union are being laid, the European coal and steel community. And the offer is made to Labour government, Attlee government, Ernie Bevin government. You could be at the founding moment. And Denis Healey wrote all the pamphlets saying, no, we're not having any of that. This is a Catholic, capitalist, kind of cartelistic conspiracy. Labour's not touching that with a barge pole. And a few years later, somebody seen as a Labour right-winger, Hugh Gaitskell, makes a great speech saying, we have not got 1,000 years of history to see Britain become a province of a European state. Our men did not die on Vimy Ridge to hand over power to Germans. That was well, the trouble with Gate School was he went to Winchester, a bit like Rishi Sunak. So they're very, very clever, but they're also very, very stupid.
Some more ideas. Matt, can I come to you on ideas quickly? Because I think kind of at the crux of this is this conversation between how much we value history as a way to inform strategy, right? Yeah. And I wonder if listening to this conversation has made you think at all about this question about Labour's foundations.
Yeah, no, it has a lot,
and
triggered some memories actually. One is of 2000, a long time ago, which I think was the Labour's 100th anniversary celebration at the Old Vic, and Blair was only 3 years into power, standing on the stage surrounded by members who hated him already. They just wanted to hear from Ken Livingstone about how to lose. So that was one memory. The other was 15 years later, and I was asked by Labour to moderate one of the leadership election hustings in Leeds, which was at Elland Road, and it was in their big conference centre just off the stadium. And it was Corbyn, Burnham, Yvette Cooper, and Liz Kendall. And Burnham, Yvette Cooper, and Liz Kendall did their bit, and Corbyn was late. And it became very clear that it was designedly late because there were 1,000 members in the room. And exactly within seconds of when he would have had to not stand and do his speech, he burst through the door, arriving artfully late from a Durham Miners gala, actually, as it happens, with an entourage. And it was genius. And they just stood up and roared. And I looked at Burnham and Kendall and Cooper, and I knew, and they knew that they'd lost. And I can't remember a single word Corbyn said, but it was brilliant. It was oratory of the highest quality. And every single word he was saying was, it's okay now, we can go back to being a heritage organisation, stop worrying about all the stuff you've been worrying about since the 1983 election, 3 decades of pain. We can go back to just everything that makes us feel good, right, and better. That's what matters. And the wave of human emotion and relief that coursed through that room was palpable.
Oh,
I knew it was,
Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, no, it was before that, but that was 2017. But even then, you could see the party was going to elect him hands down. And this speaks to Denis's point about power. Because the interesting thing about the Tory party is that the Tory party doesn't give a flying F about history.
Dennis has already sworn you can.
Yeah, no, it really doesn't. It has certain stations of the cross. You've got to talk about Thatcher, you've got to talk about Churchill, occasionally about the Corn Laws, that's it. But all they care about is power. That's all they talk about. I mean, look at them now. Right now, in Westminster, at this very moment, Tory MPs, or they won't because it's recess, but Tory MPs around the country will be talking about how or why to keep Boris Johnson in power.
Oh, they'll still be talking, I'm sure.
They will be, but they will be talking about whether or not to keep it, because that's what animates them. They won't be thinking, has he gone too far? Is this consistent with our values? How do we feel about this? What would Peel have done? They won't be, is this consistent with Friedrich Hayek's teaching? They're not thinking like that. They're thinking about the next election and their own chances. That's it. And so the paradox is that Labour, which should be the party of modernity, change, the future, is obsessed by its past. The Tories, who have the image of being the crusty, stuck in the past, custodians of everything that has gone before and the existing order, are only thinking about the next election. They think of nothing else. I mean, Johnson's government is the purest expression of Toryism in that sense, because it is only about campaigning. When it talks about levelling up or building back better or world beating, these are just words, as was take back control. It's all about winning. It's all about staying in power. It is pure power. And so I agree with Denis. I think that what Labour needs to get back is which it definitely had intermittently during the New Labour era, was a sense that there is no point in having principles if you don't have the power to do something with them. The idea that we shall not compromise with the electorate, the famous Lambeth councillor who said that, unbelievable. That is something to be ashamed of, saying that. It sounds pious and it makes people feel good about themselves, but the Labour's constituency is being ill-used by the Tories and deserves better.
Do you think that Labour's foundations have given it better ideas, right? There's a lot of people in the chat referencing The Future of Socialism by Anthony Crosland, for example, obviously massively divisive. But Dennis, in your book, for example, you say that there should be a couple of people in every cabinet who have written books, right?
I'm very keen on that. I put Matthew into most cabinets. I mean,
But it sounds like that might be maybe one of the
Check it in
reasons
the post.
why it's not going so well.
What, you mean there are too many thinkers?
Perhaps.
Well, I mean, look.
name them.
In the current
Shadow cabinet.
Well, Nick's obviously gone, right? Nick Thompson, but he wrote, obviously.
Who?
Nick Thomas-Simmons wrote.
Yeah, he's written books. You said thinkers.
Now things are just getting, you know.
This is too complicated for me.
I tell you what I do. I mean, just to finish the point, is I think that one thing Keir Starmer has in common with, Ed Miliband and Jeremy Corbyn is the belief that being right is what counts. And you can see him when he makes because he's a brilliant forensic practitioner. So when he makes a good point at PMQs, you can see his hair move with, congratulation. Doesn't matter at all. PMQs this was the mistake William Hague made. If I beat Blair at PMQs, I'm going to win the election. Not so much, William. Starmer also believes that being right is enough. It isn't. What matters is matching the needs of the political landscape and the morphology of power to the questions of the moment. That's it. And I don't see Labour doing that at the moment.
Ayesha, can I ask you, I'm aware we're coming to the end, but if you were advising Keir Starmer right now and you wanted to get around the problem that Matt just mentioned, what would you say he should do? You're talking about number 10 saying they should be preparing for an election in 23, and obviously with the events of today, with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to be issued fines, you'd be thinking this is on Keir Starmer's mind more than perhaps ever. What would you say to him about how he's to get around the kind of structural, tricky problems about Labour's relationship with its past?
Well, I think Keir Starmer has been quite clear about where his intentions lie. I mean, he famously got asked by Laura Kongsberg ahead of the last conference, what's more important to you, party unity or winning? And he said winning, and he said that without a beat. So I do think he's very seized upon the fact that he's got to win. But I think you have, like many things in life, you can't fake this. You have to know what your political mission is. You do have to really have a strong sense of, if you were just to have 100 days in government, what are the things that you would want to do? What is your vision of Britain? What is your analysis of Britain? What is your prescription for Britain? And I think that is the thing that is still really lacking from Keir Starmer. I think there's no doubt if you could just parachute him into Downing Street and you can parachute the shadow cabinet around the cabinet table, they would be infinitely better than what we've got right now. Toe to toe, each single one of them is a much stronger performer, from Rachel Reeves to Wes Streeting. There is some good talent, but what I feel there isn't a strong narrative. There isn't a proper kind of capturing the feeling of frustration that we all have. Rishi Sunak has just announced, guess what? He has deigned to pay his fine. Like, well done, thanks, good boy, ever so good. I've had so many people just messaging me during the course of this conversation from lots of people from different parties who are just saying, I just hope Labour capitalises on this, because we're not. I've had loads of Lib Dems messaging me saying we need Labour to succeed. So, but the will is there. But I just feel that I think one of the things that was so good about Blair and Brown, remember, it was a partnership, is that they did have a political hinterland. People forget they had been backbench MPs for quite a long time before. Remember, you had to get elected to get into the shadow cabinet back in those days as well. So they weren't these kind of new kids on the block. They studied politics. They studied the art of politics. They had been scarred by all those years in opposition. They knew how important it was to win. And I sometimes feel that, we still don't have a party that has quite got into its head that we could just be in opposition forever. And, to the person that mentioned about Jeremy Corbyn, the one thing I will say, and I definitely agree with what Matthew said, when I went to the first hustings for the PLP, no cameras there, no press. This was way before Jeremy Corbyn even had enough people to get him onto the ballot paper, every single other candidate could not answer a straight question. They were trapped in that kind of fag end of sort of government where literally you'd be like, do you like tea or coffee? And you'd be like, well, I really like tea, but I don't want to be discriminatory to all the coffee farmers. So maybe we could do like, I could have a mouthful of tea and then a mouthful, it's just like, oh my God. And then everybody was just like so vanilla and just saying the same thing. And just like Matthew said, Corbyn came in late wearing some kind of shell suit top and sort of came to the front and did this speech, and he blew everyone out the water. He had a narrative, his story had an arc, he had a diagnosis of Britain, he had prescriptions, he had ideas, he had radical ideas. And I remember Charlie Faulkner and I at the end of that hustings look at each other and going, if he gets on the ballot paper, he's going to win. And we all sort of laughed manically. And then that's kind of what happened. So the one thing I will say is Jeremy Corbyn was undoubtedly an absolute disaster for the Labour Party. And we are seeing the horrors of gifting that bigger majority to the Conservative Party. That bigger majority with these people in charge has led to some terrible, terrible, terrible government and some terrible decisions. But the one thing I will say that Jeremy Corbyn did do, because I try to be objective, is he did remind the party about having a bit of courage. And this was the Jim Knight's point. I will be honest with you, towards the tail end of our time in government, when I became a special advisor, we became so scared of our shadow. We weren't just scared of the Daily Mail. We were terrified of the CBI. We ran scared of those wings. We were meant to stand up for those people. I remember going to some policy forum and being told to sort of absolutely oppose anybody who wanted more equality or to build more affordable houses, like they were the enemy from the trade unions and from the members. But actually, that is the direction of travel we should be going in. So I think my thing to Keir is want power, absolutely want power, but also don't be frightened of your shadow in politics. And also, the Labour Party's got to be a bit more street smart. We have become so earnest. We're like the supply teacher of politics. Everything's like, oh, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. And it's like, come on. It's just like, sometimes you just want, we're meant to have some wit. We should have some oomph about us. We should speak the language of like normal people. We should just stop we've got to stop being supply teachers. That's my big message to Keir.
That's amazing. Thank you. And just very quickly, because I'm aware we've gone over, Nathan, I think you wanted to say something. Are you there? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember exactly why I had my hand up now, but I'll just finish off. In response to some of the things that Ayesha said, I was one of those people Ayesha was saying no to in 2008 at that policy forum. And actually, Ayesha's right. I mean, Gordon Brown did a fantastic job during the banking crisis, which he still hasn't really had his due for. Because basically Cameron and Osborne and other clever so-and-sos in Conservative HQ essentially spun a narrative that completely blew us out of the water. That it was our own fault for the spending that we'd incurred in the previous 10 years, which is incorrect. Right? The tragedy of that last period in government, we failed to renew in office. I think some of the ideas that were coming out in number 10 under Tony Blair basically just became technocracy for its sake in the run-up to 2007. And unfortunately, Gordon ended up being side blinded by the financial crisis, and quite frankly, we didn't know what to do for the last 18 months of that government. We were doggy paddling around the swimming pool. So essentially, we collectively, I guess, I mean, Ayesha, Jim, and Denis, collectively in this one, we handed the Labour Party on a plate to Jeremy Corbyn in 2015. We were like automatons waiting to come back into government, and people weren't doing the heavy lifting necessary under Ed Miliband, because I think too many people were just waiting for him to lose so they could have a proper leadership in 2015. Hopefully no one will do that again, because quite frankly, the period between 15 and 19 is probably the most serious potential tragedy in the party's history, and 2019 really was a reprieve. I guess what three things I would say in conclusion are, it's quite not dissimilar to what the others have said. There is an issue here that the Labour Party always has to remember the context of the politics it is pursuing in the here and now. And actually, it's fantastic to have that hinterland. It's fantastic to have a good understanding of the past. but we have to actually apply ourselves to the political and economic issues of today, which is why I would say to your friend in the audience, basically, virtually anything that Keir said he would run on with those 10 pledge points, I think COVID and the aftermath have blown all that out of the water. We are almost starting with the reset button, have to start from square one again. And quite frankly, there's no way we could have gone in with any of those price points attached to a manifesto. So context is key. The second thing is, I think we are getting there now. The Labour Party has to decide what the inspirational underpinnings of the modern Labour Party might be. I think we're groping towards it. Keir still hasn't necessarily come out with a definitive answer yet, because that stuff is tough, it's difficult, and we have to move beyond those focus groups. I think Denis is right, move beyond those and actually put a flag in the ground and say, actually, but this is what we stand for, and we stand for you guys out there, and we want to make a better country for everyone. And then the third issue is that narrative piece that we have to actually, I think Mr. Blair and others became too scared of the Mail and the Sun. But the key thing for 30 years ago, we could speak to the Daily Mail and we could speak to the Sun. There's another piece of work that we're bringing out in a week, 10 days time, which basically shows how we've completely flipped in terms of actually how the Labour Party communicates and what the narrative says. In that essentially working people, those people theoretically this conversation was supposed to be about, who set the Labour Party up, we're not communicating to them at all in a way that they understand or want to listen to. And Boris Johnson, of all people, has become the tribune of the people in his ability to talk to people in tabloid headlines. And we need some of that back, thank you very much. Because unless we can take him on toe to toe and prove that our vision of the future is more compelling and actually applies to everybody, whereas his is neither, we're not going to win.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to have to sum up, and I wish I didn't have to, because that was fascinating, and I feel like we didn't fully get on to what should be in the next election manifesto, for example, or what it would take to get over those obstacles. But I feel like through chatting, we did come to somewhat of a conclusion that the foundations aren't necessarily its biggest obstacles, or at least they're not obstacles by necessity in what Labour needs to do, which is to be able to find a way to craft a compelling narrative, to craft a message, and to be able to present a genuine alternative to the current government, all of which I think we'll look forward to seeing potentially much sooner than we thought after today. But who knows? Thank you so much to everyone for coming. And again, I'm sorry this ran slightly over. And thank you to everyone who contributed in the chat and from home as well. And have a lovely evening. Thank you.